Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the real macroeconomic forces that are driving, and honestly, sometimes stalling, India's massive push to become a developed nation by 2047. We are talking about hitting a mind-boggling $32 trillion economy. But to figure out how we actually get there, we have to look way past the flashy headlines and dig right into the structural mechanics at play.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll be looking at the big tech bet, MSMEs as the true growth engine, the value chain challenge, the monopoly growth trap, and finally, how we're navigating global trade. Let's just jump right in. First up, Part 1, the big tech bet.
Let's start with a number that constantly grabs global headlines, $48 billion. That is a staggering figure, and it represents Amazon's total committed investment in India by 2030. You know, just recently their global CEO Andy Jassy announced a fresh $13 billion top-up to their previous commitments. And here's the thing, this massive injection of capital, it isn't just for delivering more packages. It's heavily focused on AI and cloud infrastructure. We're talking about expanding AWS data center capacity in hubs like Mumbai and Hyderabad to push custom AI chips and advanced cloud tech.
And looking at Andy Jassy's own words here, this tells us exactly how global tech giants view the Indian landscape right now. They see it as this prime, long-term growth trajectory for data and e-commerce. They're making massive, long-term bets on India's digital public infrastructure and that booming startup ecosystem we always hear about. The end goal? Democratizing access to AI for literally 15 million small businesses.
But guys, here's where things get really interesting. Take a look at this stark contrast. On one side, you've got this glamorous, top-down investment, billions in foreign direct capital flowing straight into vast data centers and custom AI chips. But on the other side, down in the real engine room, you've got millions of micro, small, and medium enterprises, our MSMEs, fighting entirely different battles. They're out there hustling for collateral-free loans, trying to retain talent against the megacorporations, and frankly, just trying to survive the sheer weight of high compliance costs. This is the grassroots reality required to actually hit that $32 trillion target.
Which brings us right to Part 2, MSMEs as the growth engine. Because if we want to reach developed nation status, it is absolutely crucial that these MSMEs, not just the big megacorps, drive the transformation. Experts are clear. Unless per capita income jumps significantly, developed status is just a pipe dream. To really put a face to this, let's look at the deeply human story of Milky Mist founder Satish Kumar. 35 years ago, he was literally a 15-year-old kid traveling around in a milk truck. No grand ambitions. He just started experimenting with paneer, which, fun fact, was barely even known in South Indian kitchens back then. But by building real trust through totally transparent rural transactions, getting the banks to back him, and investing heavily in a massive end-to-end cold chain, he built an absolute powerhouse of a brand. He proved, without a doubt, that world-class scale can be built organically right from our agricultural roots. And get this, he did the whole shebang without ever needing to move his headquarters to a fancy metro city.
But here's the catch. Just being the world's factory floor? That's not going to cut it anymore. As this quote perfectly highlights, India's MSMEs have to transition. We have to move from simply made in India to designed, engineered, and owned in India. That is how we capture the real economic value. We can't just put the pieces together, we literally have to own the ideas behind the products.
And owning those ideas leads us into Part 3, the value chain challenge. So this ambition to really own the IP brings us face to face with a major structural hurdle in our manufacturing sector. We've got this massive, audacious goal to build a $500 billion electronics industry by 2030. Sounds great, right? But while the Make in India initiative has done a fantastic job bringing factories to our shores, experts are pointing out a glaring issue. Our ecosystem is still heavily dependent on imported components. We're assembling the parts, sure, but we aren't creating the internal architecture.
And you can see the stark reality right here in the data. We might be assembling high-end devices like iPhones for global brands, but the lion's share of the actual value creation, it stays overseas. India captures roughly 5% of the value of the phone. 5%. Meanwhile, the rest of the world holds on to 95% because they own the intellectual property and those high-value components. This dynamic is exactly what's preventing us from truly replicating China's massive manufacturing scale, where, frankly, labor productivity is still significantly higher. To close a gap like that, experts say we'll need to aggressively upskill around 100 million people over the next decade. No small feat.
Which brings us to Part 4, the monopoly growth trap. This dependency we just talked about leads us straight into a really fascinating macroeconomic paradox. Think about this. Why is it that we are investing enough capital to theoretically hit 8% growth, but we're only getting 6%? Domestic consumption is holding steady, manufacturing capacity utilization is sitting comfortably around 75%, and yet private investment seems kind of stuck in the mud. The math doesn't quite add up. Well, unless you look at the structure of the market itself.
The answer actually lies in this metric right here, ICOR, or the incremental capital output ratio. Now, simply put, this just measures how much capital you need to pump in to generate 1 unit of output. Back in the mid-2000s, this ratio was a super efficient 3 to 4. Today, it's crept up to 5 or 6. What this means in plain English is that capital is increasingly being used defensively. Companies are just protecting their margins. So every rupee of investment is yielding significantly less real growth than it used to.
So what's actually happening? Well, highly concentrated sectors are starting to act, quite frankly, like monopolies. They manage scarcity to keep prices high instead of expanding supply to meet the rising demand. Take the steel industry, for example. A tiny handful of what we call national champions controls 60% of the entire capacity. Or look up at aviation. 90% of our skies are controlled by just 2 dominant carriers. That's why your fares absolutely skyrocket during demand spikes, while new aircraft orders are super carefully phased in just to protect their yields. The whole incentive to overbuild and fiercely compete on price, it's practically vanished in these concentrated sectors.
And the ripple effect here is huge. This lack of fierce competition trickles all the way down and crushes those exact MSMEs we were talking about earlier. Get this. Smaller firms are often forced to pay GST on the invoices they raise, rather than the cash they've actually collected. So they're essentially acting as an interest-free loan for the state and for these massive corporate buyers. This dynamic traps an estimated 2 to 3 lakh crore rupees of crucial working capital right inside the supply chain. It's a financial chokehold, literally dropping new firm entry rates below 5%. And when that happens, it stifles job creation and suppresses the broader consumer demand we desperately need for rapid economic expansion.
Okay, let's move into our final piece of the puzzle, Part 5, Navigating Global Trade.
Because let's face it, how we connect our domestic markets to the rest of the world is just as critical as what we actually produce. Right now, India is playing a very strategic game of chess, holding back on finalizing the US Trade Pact. Originally, the deal looked fantastic when high reciprocal tariffs were in play. But after US courts invalidated those tariffs, the whole equation flipped. Now, India is smartly waiting out these complex international tariff shifts, specifically looking out for the results of the Section 301 probes on forced labor and excess capacity. They want to make absolutely sure that any interim trade deal gives our exporters a legitimate, real competitive advantage over rival nations like Bangladesh and Pakistan.
But before we even get to the borders, we have a domestic issue. Our extremely high domestic logistics costs are disproportionately hurting smaller firms. Look at this NCER data. We still over-rely on incredibly expensive road freight, which sits at about 3 rupees and 78 paise per ton kilometer. Now compare that to the much cheaper alternatives. Waterways are at 2 rupees 30 paise and rail is all the way down at just 1 rupee 96 paise. This massive gap in logistics costs is a huge drag on our domestic competitiveness.
So, what's the fix? Well, accelerating the transition to multimodal networks is an absolute must. We need to shift freight off the congested roads and onto dedicated rail corridors and inland waterways. It's a critical developmental imperative if we ever want to lower these landed costs. And if we combine this physical infrastructure upgrade with real digital reforms, like a trusted importer framework and AI-driven predictive customs, we can massively reduce delays and stabilize our supply chains, even in a wildly unpredictable global market.
As we wrap up this explainer, it leaves us with one incredibly critical question to ponder. We've got the flashy big tech investments, and we definitely have the MSME ambition, but the supply chain bottlenecks and this heavy market concentration are still looming large. So what is actually going to fuel the engine of a prosperous, developed society by 2047? Will India's economic future ultimately be defined by concentrated market power, or will it be driven by fair competition and true grassroots enterprise? It's a huge question. Thanks so much for joining us, and as always, keep questioning the data.